Hi, my name is Sam, and I'm a biologist with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Today, we're going to take you on an incredible journey of the salmon life cycle. So to start off, I just want to go through the goals for our session, just so that you know where we're headed. So we're going to start by examining what you already know. Maybe some of you have already studied the life cycle or know a lot, and maybe some of you haven't really given it much thought. So we'll just take a second to check in. Then we'll get into the different life stages, and you too will become experts in the salmon life cycle and the different stages. By doing this, you'll get a really good understanding of how important habitat is and what the different features are that make habitat so important. You'll also be able to describe the different impacts that different threats have on salmon and that they experience throughout their life cycle. All right, so now before we get into the lesson, I just wanted to share a few resources with you that would be really helpful in going through the salmon life cycle material. So there's a couple videos that you can check out. I would highly recommend the video I Am Salmon, which you can find on YouTube. This tells the story of the salmon life cycle from the point of view of a salmon and provides some really interesting cultural context for the different life stages and why they're so important to people, especially First Nations in British Columbia. The second one is the Yukon River salmon story, and this is another one that shows some of the threats that salmon experience and the difficulties in managing some of those, especially across international boundaries. So if you have the time, definitely check out those videos before we get started here, just to provide a bit of background on what we're going to be talking about. We're also going to be using a lot of new vocabulary and throwing out some new jargon that you may not have heard before. So to help you prepare for this, we've put together some resources on the PSF website. We've got a vocabulary sheet that goes through some of the main words that we're going to be using to describe the salmon life cycle. And there's also an activity sheet that you can use to help match keywords with their definitions and try and match them in a row or in a line. And this will really help you get a better understanding of the types of phrases we're going to be using. So if you have the time, just take a break, hit pause, go check out some of those resources, and then come back to us when you're ready. Okay, so we're ready to go. I just want to take a moment and check in and have a brief conversation about what is a life cycle. If you have a post-it note handy or a notebook, piece of paper, take 1 minute and just write down whatever comes to mind when you think about life cycles. It doesn't have to be related to salmon. Just take a few moments, write that down. We'll come back to it at the end of the lesson, so you can just push it off to the side of your desk and then come back to us. Great, thanks for doing that. Now we can get into today's lesson. We're going to be talking about the life cycle and habitat and its importance throughout the life cycle. So the migration of salmon from freshwater to saltwater is one of the most amazing phenomena that happens on our coasts. You have this exchange of resources between these different habitats, and they provide such importance to many of the ecosystems and to the cultures and people of British Columbia. So as I go through the life stages, I'll tell you a little bit about them and then a bit about the habitat that they need, as well as some of the threats they face. I may throw a question or two at you as we go as well, and so if I do that, just take a second to pause, think about the question, and then continue with the lesson. Okay, so let's get started. Life for a salmon starts in the egg. So when the adults return to the rivers in the fall, the female will match up with a male and she will dig a nest in the gravel with her strong tail. Eggs are really vulnerable at this stage in their life, so by burying them, they're protected from strong flows that would push them downriver or from predators that are cruising through the river looking to pick off eggs. So this gets us to some of the threats that eggs might face at this stage of their life. Many of the eggs that are laid will actually never hatch, and this could be due to a variety of reasons, such as improper fertilization of the eggs, disease. When you have lots of animals or eggs in this case close together, it's easier for a disease to spread, or predation. So we have other fish, other salmon and trout that will swim through the rivers and eat eggs, as well as birds can go through and pick through the eggs. So at this stage, they are called Alevin. Alevin are what hatch from the eggs, and they come out with this large orange yolk sac attached to their bellies. This is their food source for the next 4 to 6 weeks. They can't feed for themselves, and so they stay hidden in the gravel, protected from strong flows or predators feeding off of their yolk sac. The habitat is this same gravel bed where the eggs were originally laid, and so the threats are somewhat similar to what we experience as at an egg stage. There's issues around poor water quality. If there's sedimentation or pollution going into the river, they're trapped in the gravel bed where they're residing, and so will be at risk of these elements in the river. Once again, predation, you have other fish and birds coming through and finding alevin and feeding on them, and other habitat disturbances that could break up the gravel or crush the alevin in the gravel. At this point, their life has been entirely in the gravel bed where they were born, but mortality rates, or the rate at which they die, are really high. They typically experience about 80% mortality while they're still in the gravel. So if we go back to the female laying her eggs in the riverbed, if we imagine she laid 4,000 eggs, of those, only 800 would actually emerge from the gravel as fry, which is our next life stage. Here, they've run out of food in their yolk sac. They need to leave and enter the river to find food. They also start to change color. They develop these dark bars along the sides of their body, known as parr marks. Now, here's a question for you. Why do you think it would be beneficial to change color? So I want you to take a moment and think about it or discuss it with someone, and then come back. Okay, well, you may have guessed, but the change in coloration is really important for camouflage and protecting them from predators. You can see there's the light and shadow in the river that plays across the bottom, and the parr marks help them blend in and hide from predators. At this stage, the habitat that they reside in are typically slower flowing pools. They're still not strong enough to be swimming against the current, so they'll often drift downstream a ways until they find a safe pool with enough habitat features such as roots or boulders and woody debris where they can hide from predators and still forage in the river. There's another very important event that happens during the early life stages in freshwater. So from eggs through alevin and now fry, the salmon are actually learning the smells of their environment. And this may seem a little strange. Did you know that salmon had such an excellent sense of smell? Well, they do. Even underwater, everything gives off a chemical smell or chemical signal. The rocks, the other plants, the vegetation, the water itself, and all of these things mixed together create a unique signal that the salmon memorize and learn so that they can find their way back to that exact spot when they return as adults. And this is known as imprinting. Some of the threats that fry face in the freshwater are things like now lack of food. Maybe there's not enough and maybe they need to think about heading down to the ocean. Predation is still an issue, so we've got birds and other fish still hunting on fry. And then habitat destruction is always an issue in freshwater, where you're concerned about things that might be happening in the watershed or directly in the river that could be affecting fish habitat. When they are ready to make the downstream migration, they are known as smolts. Smolts start to undergo this physiological change in their body. They know they're heading from freshwater to saltwater, and to be able to live and breathe in saltwater, their kidneys and their gills undergo some big changes to prepare for living and breathing in salt water. Their skin also starts to change color. They don't need to blend into the shadows in the riverbed anymore. They're going to be out in the open ocean, so they start to turn silver. Then they're ready to migrate downstream. And before we go any further, I just want to ask you, why do you think salmon migrate in the first place? What would be a reason to leave the freshwater and head out to the big ocean? Take a second to think about it and then come back to us. So this may have been a tough question, but the idea is that the ocean is more productive and has more food and more resources available for salmon to allow them to grow big. It's a trade-off that they have. Stay in the rivers where mortality may not be as high, but they can't grow as big, or go to the ocean where they may experience lots of mortality, but there's lots more food and they can grow very big. So over time, evolution has led to the latter, where they migrate to the sea and develop and grow into these large adults. So one of the important habitats for smolts is where fresh water meets the salt water. And in this area, you typically find estuaries. Estuaries are very important habitat to salmon. They're like nurseries because you've got a mix of fresh and salt water. They're not just being thrown straight into salt water. And there's often vegetation such as eelgrass beds, which provide cover while they're adjusting to this new life and can hide from predators. These are also very productive areas. We've got nutrients coming in from the rivers as well as being mixed up from the ocean, that there's lots of food available. There are lots of threats that smolts face at this life cycle as well. So estuaries, or where rivers meet the ocean, are also where humans have developed and settled. Think of Vancouver, the Port of Vancouver, the ferry terminals. There's lots of docks and dikes that go into these nearshore areas around areas where humans have settled and developed. The problem with that is that we remove a lot of the important habitat in estuaries, such as those eelgrass beds, where they typically hide and rear for the first few weeks of their ocean life. Predation is another big one. Predators have also figured out that estuaries are a great place for juvenile salmon to live, and so you have new predators such as seals or sea lions or other birds coming and preying on smolts when they first enter the ocean. Now that they're out in the ocean, they're adults, and this is where they'll spend most of their lives. Typically, it depends on the species, but they'll spend 1 to 4 years in the ocean. If they've made it this far, they're doing really well. Mortality and all these threats that they face throughout their life cycle mean that not many of those original eggs actually make it out to the open ocean. So if you remember, we talked about having 4,000 eggs to start with, and of those, 800 emerged from the gravel. Now, as we've gone through the smolt stage and coming out to the open ocean, only about 200 of those eggs will actually make it to the open ocean as adults. So there's more food out in the ocean, so they can grow big. The things they eat are typically small fish, squid, and zooplankton. The habitat out here is the open ocean. They're traveling long distances, using ocean currents, and we don't know a lot about where they're going. Typically they're following prey, but there's still a lot to learn about what happens out in the open ocean. This includes knowing what some of the threats are, what are some of the causes of mortality. And so I want you to take a second to think about this. We've been talking a lot about threats at the other life stages. Can you think of what some of the threats they might experience out in the open ocean? Take a minute and think about it, and then come back. Now we come back to their sense of smell. And so they're able to navigate their way along the coast and pick up that smell of their home, their natal stream where they were born. Once they get to the river mouth, they then face a very long migration, and it can be hundreds to thousands of kilometers upstream before they reach their spawning grounds. Some of the longest salmon migrations are actually up to 3,000 kilometers. And just to help you imagine that, that would be like walking across half of Canada. They can also swim up to 50 kilometers a day during this upstream migration, which is the equivalent of running a marathon every day. So this is a very energetically demanding stage of the life cycle and requires every last ounce of energy that they have. But they actually start to undergo physiological changes, one of them being that they stop feeding. So to get this energy, they start to absorb some of the tissues in their body to go towards reproduction. They also start to change color. So they go from this flashing silver to bright reds and greens, which they use to attract mates, and also develop, especially the males, will develop features such as hooked noses or humpbacks, which show the females that they are a healthy, suitable partner, but also can be used to fight off other males on the spawning grounds. So the females, once they've found a male, they will dig a red in the gravel, as I mentioned, and they typically lay anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 eggs. The males will then come along and they secrete their milt, which is used to fertilize the eggs. The females may lay more than one red, and they may linger in the river and protect their reds. However, shortly after spawning, they will die. And this is an important part of the life cycle in that the nutrients from the adult salmon and from their carcasses are left in the rivers where their eggs are laid to provide nutrients in those systems, provide nutrients to the land and to the other animals in the water and that rely on salmon in those systems. So habitat is still a really important feature, even at this last stage of the life cycle. It's really important that they have clean, flowing water, rich with oxygen, so that they have a healthy environment to lay their eggs. They need to find the right consistency gravel and make sure that it hasn't become smothered or blocked with sediment or sand. They still face many threats, and so on that upstream migration, they face things like pollution, which may make it more difficult to smell their way home. Things like climate change, so I mentioned temperature or flow. If the water is very warm, salmon typically need about 18-degree river temperature water. If it's too warm, they may linger and wait in the ocean, hoping that temperatures will drop so they can swim upstream. But that's not always possible, and in warm waters, salmon may never actually make it to their spawning grounds to spawn. Predation is always an issue, so you have the seals and sea lions and whales still going for the salmon as they come back, but you also have grizzly bears and eagles lining the riverbanks. Fishing is another big threat. Salmon at this stage in their life are the biggest, healthiest, most nutritious they can be, and so this is where fishers typically target salmon, and you'll see lots of seine and gillnet fisheries across the mouths of rivers to capture salmon on this return migration. There are also dams and obstructions in the river. You may have heard of the Big Bar landslide that's blocking thousands and thousands of Fraser River salmon from making it to their spawning grounds. These are some of the big threats that salmon face. All right, well that's enough for me talking to you. Now let's get into an activity that'll really help you think about these concepts and think about the salmon life cycle. So as we're getting set up here, I'd love for you to grab a piece of paper, a pen, and if you have any coloring pencils or markers, definitely pull those out as well. Once you're ready, come back to us and I'll let you know exactly what we're doing next. All right, salmon biologists, here's the situation. There's been some concern and some dialogue in the community about what's happening to salmon, and the community has organized a workshop to bring together the different stakeholders and have a discussion about what can be done. So we've got fishers, we've got loggers, we've got concerned citizens like yourself who just want to know a bit more and make sure that everyone's informed. Because everyone comes from such different backgrounds, it would be really helpful if we could have a local expert come and tell us a little bit about the salmon life cycle so we're all starting on the same page before we get into the workshop. This is where you come in. You are now our local salmon experts, and you're going to be providing some context and some information to the community about the salmon life cycle. So how are we going to do this? I want you to take your piece of paper and you're going to create a short fact sheet that provides the essentials of one of the life stages. So for that life stage, I want you to provide the key information about that life stage, what's the main function or the main thing that happens during that stage, and what are the key habitat features. You can also get really creative with this. So you can draw the life stage or draw the habitat that they use during this life stage. Remember, you're sharing this with members of the community, so you want it to be visually appealing, but short and to the point. Once you've done that, come back to us and we will regroup before we present to the community. Okay? Great. All right, time's up. I hope you've put your fact sheet together. We're now going to bring it all together and share with the community. So if you're on your own, we're going to go through your life cycle, but if you're in a class setting, I'd like you to one at a time go up to a board or a wall and tape your piece of the life cycle onto the wall so that we can create an entire life cycle. As you're doing this, I'd like you to take a second and say out loud to me or to whomever you're with what you have on your fact sheet. What do you think the important features of the life stage are, and tell us what's really important about it. Okay? So I'll give you a second to do that and then we'll regroup. Okay, amazing. You learned so much about the salmon life cycle, and being able to piece it together and talk about the importance and the connections with the habitat is really important to the community. So now you've shared this information with us. The community, we kind of feel we know a little bit more, but we have some questions. So I would ask you to think about some of the threats that salmon face given what you know about the salmon life cycle. So let's say I'm one of those concerned citizens in the workshop. I have a question for you. I noticed some logging up in the watershed last summer, and I'm concerned about the effects that might be having on the spawning grounds. What do you think the effect of logging would be, and should we be concerned? Why don't you take a second and think about the impact that that might have on your life stage that you've described, and then come back to me. Okay, great. I have another question though. So I was out fishing with my dad last summer, and we noticed a ton of fishing boats at the mouth of the Fraser. Is that something we should be concerned about? And what do you think the impacts of fishing are on the salmon migration and the salmon life cycle? This is another question I want you to take a moment to think about and then come back to us. Well, I have one last question before we get going with the workshop. Climate change is such a big issue these days. I'm wondering, what impact does that have on salmon? If rivers are getting warmer, if the ocean's getting warmer, does that have any impact on the salmon and on the different life stages? And on which life stage would we see the strongest impacts? Again, take a minute, think about it, and then let's regroup. Okay, good work everyone. That was a fantastic introduction to the workshop. Thank you very much. You are now salmon experts, and we will wrap up the lesson there. So I would encourage you to continue thinking and continue discussing these topics. One of the things that you can do to think about the importance of the life cycle is to think, what are some of the threats to fish in your local rivers? Maybe other than salmon. What have you seen? Or next time that you go by a salmon stream, take a look at the quality of the habitat, of the gravel, and see what you think. Is it suitable? Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Once again, I'm Sam from Pacific Salmon Foundation, and it was a pleasure to share the salmon life cycle with you today.